Using ODI to load Essbase data. Here are some reasons for using ODI to load Essbase data. If you're using ODI to load planning metadata and are perhaps using Maxell scripts to load the data, here's an opportunity to merge the processes into a single tool. You have a need to load Essbase data from multiple systems, such as your GL or your Salesforce system. You need SQL-type data transformations from the source system to the target system. Perhaps you have a need for audit trail functionality. ODI also comes with its own scheduler. Security, such as who can run a job or who can see the data flows or edit SQL transformation code, is available in ODI. This diagram shows how the data flows through ODI. In our case, we're using Microsoft SQL Server as the data source and Essbase, of course, as the target. First, there's the topology layer. Stored here is the information for how to connect to the source technology, as well as driver and URL addresses. Next is the model component. This lets us understand what the table structure is like in the source technology, as well as what the Essbase cube looks like for data loading. The interface is where we do the mapping of columns from the source to the target, as well as any data transformations. Finally, we load the Essbase cube. The first thing we need to do is set up the environment in ODI, and this is done through the topology layer. The next thing we do is set up the physical architecture for Essbase connection. You'll notice that we've typed in a name for the data server. We've also typed in the server name as well as the user ID and password to be able to connect to Essbase. The next thing we need to do is give it a schema. And the schema simply lays out what application and database we want to go after in Essbase. The next thing we need to do is worry about our data source. In our case, we're going after SQL Server, but you could use any of the technologies available within ODI to connect to, such as Teradata or Oracle. We set up the data server, we give it a name, and we also give it our connection information, what server it is, as well as our user ID and password. And then we follow along and tell it what database we want to go after within SQL Server. The next thing we need to do is model the source and target data that we're going after. So the first thing we're going to do is model Essbase, and this is done through the ODI Designer tab under the Models heading. We give it a name, we tell it what technology we're going to use, and then we give it a logical schema, which we defined in the topology before. Then we say reverse engineer. This goes out to Essbase and interrogates the application and database we defined in the topology and brings us back the dimensions that are pertinent to that application and database, as you can see in the left-hand panel under models. The next thing we need to do is model our data source. Our data source is SQL Server, and we do the same thing we did for Essbase. We give it a name, we tell it what technology we're using, we tell it what schema we're going to use. Again, we define that when we set up the topology. And the next thing we do is reverse engineer that particular database. And you'll notice that it brought it in and told us what columns we have in the table we're interested in. Our next step is to create the interface. This is where we actually map the data to the target area. So as you can see in the right-hand pane, the left panel, that is our data. That's coming from SQL Server. And in the right-hand panel, that is where our target is, and that happens to be our Essbase cube. Now, those two objects got in there because we dragged them in from the models that we created in the step before. And simply to map the data, we can click and drag, and I'll give you an example of, let's say we clicked on period and dragged it over into the target data store and dragged it to the column named period. It would then fill in under that mapping column, the period. It would say data.period. Data is the data source from the left-hand panel, and period is the target for Essbase. And that is accessed via the mapping tab. The next part of the interface is we want to go into the flow tab. And we do that, and then we can see if our interface is going to work. You'll notice the little connectors that say LKM SQL to SQL and IKM SQL to Hyperion Essbase Data. These were derived from Oracle provided knowledge modules. By default on the installation, the knowledge modules are not shown to the ODI Studio. So you have to import those knowledge modules, and that's documented in the ODI documentation. And the last piece down at the bottom there, you'll notice that's where we set up our error trapping. So what log file do we want to give it? What name, what directory it lives in. And so this is where we want to place the log files for this particular interface when it runs, so we can capture errors and also see what our job did. The next step is, if you notice on the upper left, we hit the play button. That will actually execute this interface. So it will go out to SQL Server, grab the data, and then load the Essbase cube. The last piece is we want to check the operator. All of the tabs in the left-hand pane can be accessed using the View portion of the toolbar. And once we bring that in, we can see with green check marks that we have a successful load. Don't worry about the warnings, because that's exactly what they are. They're warnings, they are not errors. This tells us our job completed successfully. And that is how one loads Essbase data using ODI.